Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the latest episode of our Utopias podcast. This one is a really stimulating conversation with a remarkable artist, filmmaker, writer, and political organizer, Astra Taylor. Astra is just wonderful and so interesting, stimulating to talk with. And you'll really hear that in this conversation that I had with Astra, recorded on July 11th. Astra is the director most recently of a film called What is Democracy, and is the author of a book called Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. She is a very, very interesting writer and thinker, has written a wonderful book also that I read some years ago called The People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age. So there's just a great deal of topics. There's quite a few really interesting topics that I cover with Astra in this conversation, including the state of where we're at in the United States and around the world with the rise of global neo-fascism, specifically an eye toward the United States and the mayoral campaign and successes of progressive Zoran Mamdani, which is where we start our conversation. What are the challenges we face to actually support and fight for a democracy that actually reins in the insecurities brought upon by what many call late-stage capitalism, especially as we see incredible income inequalities start to take root further and further in the United States and around the world, greater divisions tied to the directions tech has taken, and a conversation, of course, in this conversation, Astra and I also discuss her wonderful and really important piece with Naomi Klein called End Times Fascism, and kind of what to do about these forces that have aligned to make neo-fascism more of a reality than ever, at least in this country, in many decades, and how it's an alliance between different groups and different factions, from tech oligarchs to the MAGA realm to even the realm of evangelicals and rapture kind of connected folks. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. It is incredibly stimulating, and we discuss some of her real successes, from times in Occupy to the wonderful and important group, the Debt Collective, that Astra is a co-founder of. Everybody enjoy this conversation today. Thank you. Astra, I'm really excited to have you on. Thank you for joining our Utopias podcast today.
Really excited to be here.
Great. So you're a New Yorker, I believe. You're there sitting in New York. We've seen this, remarkable victory of Zoran Mamdani. I'm a big fan of Mira Nair and Zoran's father, as well as a scholar and as a lover of the arts. And we're seeing the New York Times and everybody else. I mean, the New York Times and the Democratic Party establishment, and of course the fascist right, go after and try to tear this guy's head off, not even for being rhetorically particularly left, but for just describing affordability and economic populism. What gives? How would you narrate what is going on here? And how do you as a New Yorker see this sort of chain of events unfolding? Does any of this surprise you as well?
Yeah, I was incredibly surprised by the magnitude of Mamdani's victory. I mean, he killed it in the Democratic primary. And he did so, I think, because he mixed some really important elements together and did it really well. I mean, one, he had a platform that spoke to people's material interests, just affordability, transit, jobs, the livability of this city that is getting increasingly expensive and inhospitable. So he kind of made people fall in love with New York City again, right? Like his ads had this quality of like, New York City, yes, there's crime, there's grime, but like it's the place to be. It's freaking great, and we can make it better. So that mix of like policy and attachment to place. Then he also had just a strong sense of like moral conviction, right? Like he didn't seem like a flip-flopper. And so when there were bad faith media attacks, when people were asking him about Palestine, which folks are so afraid of, he spoke from a place of principle and values and groundedness. I think that was just so refreshing. And then he is an organizer. He had 50,000 people volunteering for his campaign. People were knocking on doors and record-breaking heat, which also just drove home the fact we are in a climate crisis. And so I think those elements, it electrified people. And it's incredibly ironic that in this moment, the Democratic Party is like, oh gosh, how do we like reach young voters and how do we actually win some elections? That this guy's showing the way with what are ultimately pretty milquetoast social democratic policies, right? Like affordability. I mean, he's not saying nationalize the banks or something, but they're just, absolutely freaking out and refusing to take the win. And it says a lot about the problems with the Democratic Party, because I think Mamdani is just so important, not just for New York City, but showing what an anti-fascist politics can and should look like. And it's one that is totally serious about the threat, but also rooted in love and rooted in community and like joyous and makes you want to be part of it and makes you feel included. And it's like, no wonder the guy can't walk down the street now without just everyone wanting to hug him and take a selfie, because, he's just this like amazing breath of fresh air. I think he's a really precious human.
I even like some of his emceeing more than I used to, just to be totally honest.
Now I'm like,
and
everything
the
he
whole
does is
DOS
great.
racist crew that I know are his buddies, and it's like with someone like that, it's like we all have mutual friends with someone like that, right? All maybe not all of us, but all of us who care about the arts, that care about music, that care about DIY culture, that like care about hip hop, whatever it is, right? Care about Africa. I've spent time there. It's just hard not to feel actually relatability when we see that, when we see his example, and it's a reminder to me, and I guess this is where I want to go, is like if you look at recent polls, Bernie Sanders remains the most popular politician in the United States, despite being taken out twice by the Democratic National Committee. I was honored to be a policy advisor and a surrogate for Sanders. I still work with some progressives in the U.S. Congress, like what's left of that, or well, hopefully it's going to be revived more and more. And both him and Zoran Mamdani pointed out that he kind of got woke up. He kind of got activated because of Bernie, just like AOC said in the context of Standing Rock. And so I guess what I want to ask is, we see this complete mismatch between people by and large loving these sorts of public figures like Mamdani and Bernie forever, who just seem to be honest and not so rhetorically radical, but just want things to work and be kind of common sense and care for all, relative to these forces that be that essentially are enshrining political candidates and political power. So, like, what gives from all of that? Why do you believe that Bernie is still incredibly popular? Why are candidates who might be called all sorts of horrible names, though I don't necessarily think the word socialist is bad at all. I think it's a great word, or even the word communist, if we actually look at what it actually means. But why? Like, what do you think is going on there? Like, with popularity being so detached from these political structures of power.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure you have lots of thoughts on this too, and thank you for your service and trying to help the Bernie campaign. Just I feel grateful to all the people who are out volunteering with Mamdani. I mean, I think it's oligarchy, right? I mean, it is the concentration of wealth and power, and at this point, wealth is so concentrated. I mean, there was just yet another Oxfam report the other day talking about how much wealth that not just billionaires but centibillionaires, right, have amassed just in the last few years. I mean, for these folks, they are so thin-skinned. They see the tiniest bit of regulation as apocalyptic. We're going to kind of talk about apocalyptic politics here in this conversation. um, you know we see the way that people responded to Mamdani's win, right, with these billionaires sort of clutching their pearls and saying, oh my God, we're going to have to flee the city. This is so horrible, when in fact what we're talking about is policies that would make the city more livable, right, that would make the city more hospitable to everyone. And ultimately, I think the benefits of the proposals someone like Mamdani is making or Sanders is making would redound up through all levels of economic affluence. I mean, yes, we might tax people a bit at the tip top, but the fact is, life would be better for folks. Everybody needs air they can breathe, and to not have their summer camps washed away in deadly floods, right? So I think the problem is that popularity is not synonymous, is not a synonym for power. And this is why I am relentlessly focused on the question of organizing. It's like, I would say before the Bernie train, before Occupy Wall Street, to be on the left was like, damn, I don't got power, I don't got popularity. Like we just felt so marginal. And then we sort of were like, whoa, we, the left, we're more popular than we thought. Right? Like, wow, actually, and it's like, duh, yeah, people want Medicare for all. They want education that works. They want living wages. They actually want regulation of corporations. But we have not yet figured out how to translate that into power. And the right is, not just out organizing the left, but they are doing that because they have this amazing constant spigot of artificial fertilizer in the form of just cash that can fund their efforts. And also, their politics are fundamentally different. I mean, an authoritarian politics is just a very different project than a democratic grassroots socialist project that wants to bring people in. So, I think we should take a lot of heart in the fact that Bernie remains as popular as he is. I think this, Mamdani shows that, and Mamdani shows how potent that can be when coupled with incredible organizing and strategy. But we have to work on the organizing dimension, on the power building dimension. We have to do it really urgently, and it's tough because the forces of division are so powerful. And it's also tough because the right gets stronger the more the left leaves power on the table. And I think this is something Naomi Klein has been really brilliant in sort of articulating in her book Doppelganger, is like, when we leave a vacuum, when we, the left, leave a vacuum, the right fills it. So then you get Trump talking populist, right? Like his campaign kind of had three pillars. It was like economic populism, anti-war messaging, and, immigrants, mass deportations. Well, we're only getting one of those pillars, right? We're not getting the anti-war. We're not
He
getting
was
the
only
economic
honest about
populism.
one of the three, right?
One of the three, right? That's what we're getting. But he took that, he stole that fire. He took that, that aggravation, that anger that was there, that was so potent, that could have gone in a Bernie direction. And the right captured it, and it was in part because the corporate, political, neoliberal, whatever you want to call them, democratic centrist establishment, would rather see the left lose than see the right lose.
That's actually exactly that's actually exactly where I was going, right? It's sort of, it seems like, as much as the CNNs and New York Timeses, and I know there are good people working at all these organizations, so it's not about defaming any journalist actually, but that these organizations, seem to be much more interested in a fascism and authoritarianism that does not, provide some basis taxes on the rich or some basic social services for working and middle class people. They would rather have fascism than that, it seems like. And that is hard to stomach for me, given how incredibly cruel and inhumane this Trump administration has been and will continue to be.
And I think it's heartbreaking, and it's also strategically really worrying, because we do need a popular front to defeat, I think, to defeat the far right, given its alliance with corporate America, its alliance with big tech. And so I do think, a case constantly has to be made to those people that ultimately, they're in a sort of self-defeating cycle. I'm not, I don't, I it's a real problem. I would say after this recent presidential election, and having organized very aggressively against the Biden administration to win something very modest. The group I co-founded, the Debt Collective, was only fighting to cancel student debt, which is a pretty modest demand. Just how hard that was with the Democratic administration. I mean, it definitely took me a few months of just being like, God damn it. I'm angry at the right, but I'm also angry at the Democrats that they were so obstinate and couldn't see how ultimately, by refusing to deliver for working people and middle class people, they were not just shooting themselves in the feet, but also bringing all of us down this very dark road.
And I mean, look at where we stand right now as a nation, and we can also look on the planetary level, right? Three people, well, actually now one, with the equivalent wealth to half the United States population. The youngest generation is the first to make less than their parents. These are not progressive, like lefty positions. These are validated empirical economic studies. The youngest generation first to make less than their parents in the history of the US, even if you control for inflation, which is very high, as we all know, and did not drop since Trump took over. And we see declining life expectancy in this country and in the UK because of the asymmetric distribution and access to the basic resources that, not just technologies, but including technologies make possible, like medical technologies and so on. So you have this kind of perverse sort of decoupling where things are getting worse and worse and worse for 99% of us, and yet at the same time, we see this massive hoarding of wealth and power in the hands of the extremely limited few who have absolutely no belief in the future or the planet or our country or in democracy, or it seems like in women. And like, what's up with that? And so, here I'm starting to touch on your beautiful piece with Naomi Klein that I thought was really inspiring and spot on, which is the rise of end times fascism. So speak to us, in whatever ways you choose about all of this. It's heavy.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll jump right in there and just sort of convey the thesis of the piece. And it is heavy. I think that's part of why Naomi invited me to write the piece with her, was that in a way, sometimes it's good to have a buddy, some solidarity when you're looking into the void. And so we were really wondering, and it had been a question on my mind as well, as, we use words like authoritarianism, fascism, but where are the continuities between the sort of far right reactionary politics we're seeing right now, and where are the ruptures? Like, sort of what's old, what's new? And I think there's a way that historical analogies can kind of lead us astray. Like, if we're expecting fascism in the United States in 2025 to look exactly like the Nazis, well, then we're always going to be like, I guess it's not quite fascism yet. Well, no, it's going to take a new form, and it's going to be a variation on old themes, and we call it end times fascism because we think what is aligning the right is precisely sort of what you got at, which is an abandonment of the future, a sort of sense that the shit's hitting the fan, and so you might as well try to bunker yourself, protect maybe your in-group, and take all you can. And so, when we were talking about, if you go back to the sort of neoliberal era, the 80s, people were talking about the end of history, right? Oh, it's the end of history. We're not battling socialism or communism anymore. Capitalism has won. Well, now it's the end times. It's like, actually, capitalism won. Capitalism extracts and it exploits. So we're burning up the carbon. We're burning people's, we're burning up human labor. We're just, we're eating everything up, and the end is nigh. And that's happening on a material level, but it's also happening on a mythic level as well, because so we sort of analyze the confluence, the alliance that makes up the end times fascist coalition, because like all political forces are coalitions. They can be internally contradictory. And if you read sort of the historians of fascism, they actually say this, like, fascism is actually it's always got a kind of incoherence. It's not totally ideologically pure. A fixation with sort of purity is part of its politics, but ideologically it always is very contradictory and strange. And so the sort of three poles of this political movement, one is the sort of MAGA coalition that we know of, right? So this group is apocalyptic in its thinking that it is convinced that wokeism and immigrants and the politically correct left and are destroying America, right? They are in an existential battle. It's us or them, and so they respond by wanting to bunker the nation, right? Fortress America, mass deportations, and the like. So that's one leg of the stool. The other is the sort of theocratic religious right. Now, that's not a new story, but the people who are really driving politics today are Christian Zionists and Christian nationalists who have this strong conviction that the rapture is coming and all of the bad news is actually just a sort of sign of biblical prophecy. These folks are a real potent political force. They just had a conference, for example, in DC a couple of weeks ago, where 5,000 Christian Zionists met and rallied and went and fanned out through the Capitol, knocking on the doors of their representatives, saying, yes, yes, we want more war in the Middle East and war with Iran. So that's the other prong. And the third is the big tech. And you have written a lot about tech. I've written a lot about tech over the years. I kind of look back at my writing from 2014, 2015. I was really trying not to sound like too much of a curmudgeon, like as much as I was like, this is not democracy, this is not democratizing, this is not good. But now I'm like, God, they didn't deserve a mote of generosity, because these guys have, we've all seen it. I mean, they've gone so far. It's been head spinning watching these guys go to the far right, line up, at Trump's inauguration, get those green pledges they were talking about, throw those out the window, tear them up and say, yeah, we're going to burn fossil fuels and gas and coal and stuff to build these data centers, to create AI, which they present as this sort of, inevitability, right? Even though nobody's asking for it. And there's a kind of rapture-esque quality to that too, because when you hear them talk, it's like, they're talking about superseding the human, or even us merging with computers. It's a very anti-human, anti-earth, anti-life philosophy, right? Like they're building something better than us, flawed human beings. They're building, super intelligence, and a lot of it is hype and BS, but they can do a lot of damage, even if their technological fictions don't manifest. So these three prongs, like there's contradictions, a lot in the press we'll see like, oh, Bannon blasted Musk, or Trump and Musk are fighting, or the tech bros don't quite fit in with the MAGA. And it's like, yes, that's all really important, especially strategically. We might want to try to divide them somehow, or, and they have different ruptures in kind of their bases, but the piece is really what's uniting these guys. And it is this apocalyptic kind of like, this planet, the people on it, none of them matter except us or our group. And you know what, it's in time, so yeah, the world's on fire, but let's pour some gasoline on it and cash in, and that's new, and that's bad.
That's such a great point, though, about how different forms of fascism recombine in different ways in different times and places, right? And how, fascism can represent the sort of amalgamation, even if there are internal dissonances between different strands. And that's why I love the piece, because it helped us make sense of what the hell is going on here and how strange and weird all of it is. So, like, let's just go one by one, right? Like with MAGA, Steve Bannon is constantly using language from the scholarly left and the progressive left. Previous guest on this podcast, Yanis Varoufakis, coined the term techno-feudalism. Bannon is using that left, right, and center. He doesn't mean anything by it, because he doesn't want to do anything actually about it for working people, other than just claim that he can protect them by attacking and being xenophobic and racist and totally effed up, right? And this is the pain we're all sitting through as in Los Angeles, but we're seeing this around the country with this invasion of these gangster paramilitary. That's what I think they are, straight up gangsters in our city. Like these are the gangsters, these are the paramilitaries, these are the criminals. One, two, the Zionist evangelical. So strange that the protection of these folks is called anti-Semitic when they are themselves the most anti-Semitic folks. So, I mean, obviously that's been a big lie that's circulated, and we personally were betrayed around those issues by our own administration and by our own city and by the LAPD. What's new? With our encampment, which was started by like some of my students in JVP and SJP. And then this big tech thing, it's like, you said it so beautifully just there, because when you were talking about the end of history, Francis Fukuyama, actually, these people believe in the end of life, the end of life. And so, I may have told you this before, but I've been going to the Himalayas, interviewing these Tibetan monks, trying to describe to them transhumanism and androids. I don't mean the phone, I mean like the replicants from Blade Runner, and asking them if this is life, and just kind of watching their reactions and writing about it. It's pretty hilarious and also sad. And they just sort of like being like, that's not life. Like there is no life without mortality. Not that we want mortality all the time at all costs. We don't want to all die, but we recognize that in life and death, there's a dialectic relationship. So, all right. So, you and Naomi Klein make this brilliant point toward the end of the piece, and I was watching both you and her kind of do the rounds on the piece, like with a lot of interest, and that kind of provoked me to reach out to you, which I've been wanting to do for a long time for the podcast. That actually the solution to it is actually believing in ourselves, maybe believing in one another. How about that? The demos, and maybe believing in the only planet we've ever known life to exist in. It seems like a much more palatable alternative, just kind of, it doesn't have to be blind faith, but sort of like getting back to life, back to reality, back to life, back to reality, right? Um, but so help us think through that. Like what's the kind of counterpoint to all this horrible cynicism and deflation?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I like the word utopias a lot, so maybe we'll play with that because that's the name of the podcast, and the left and the right. I mean, we tend to picture utopias out there, a future thing, something we're working towards. So if we look at on a really sort of like vulgar Marxist, level, it's like, Marxists want to build utopia in the world, right? It's materialist. It's like we are human beings. We construct our reality. We can construct our reality differently. Part of why that's so offensive to certain Christian traditions, not all, but certainly some of the evangelicals who built the foundation of Christian Zionism, it's like, how dare this guy say we could have heaven on earth down the road? We believe that we only have heaven in the afterlife. The earth is like a grubby little pit stop on the way to, the celestial paradise. And I think Naomi and I've been thinking about how we have to remind people about those building blocks of utopia that are here with us. And that's why I think Mamdani's campaign and the way it helped people fall in love with New York was so powerful, right? Like the way his videos were shot, and they almost had this like retro vibe, like filter on them. And it's just like, wow, it's full of people. Like, isn't it great? We actually walk outside our apartments and we meet humans, like not bots. And there's social contact. And sure, that means that it can be crowded and loud, but it also means it's lively and that it's surprising. I mean, I see that in the videos I've seen of Los Angeles residents fighting for their community, saying, we love it here. We love our community. We love the people who make up our community. By the way, we understand they're just trying to make a living. Like we're all just trying to live, and that, I think it's very simplistic, but I think it's really powerful in the face of a politics that's all about annihilation. So when we have somebody like Elon Musk, saying we've got to get to Mars, because we don't want to be stuck on Earth. And it's like, we're not stuck here. We're like, this is amazing. This is the one, as you said, it's the only planet we know of where we can possibly survive. And also, if you talk to freaking, astrophysicists, you know what they tell you about Mars? It's not going to work. It's like, talk to a scientist, dude. There's actually a great book by a guy called Adam Becker called that just came out called More Everything Forever. And he is a physicist, and he just has some amazing debunking about, he's just like, okay, let me just talk to you about why we are never going to colonize Mars, and why actually, if we try it, we're just creating hell on this other planet. Let's try to protect what we've got. And that means pushing against a kind of Judeo-Christian myth that has devalued earthly life, devalued the corporeal, definitely devalued the feminine, and instead I think being militant about how wonderful it is to be here and to be mortal and to be like, that's okay. And this is what we've got, this is what we've got to work with. Let's make it good, not just in some distant utopia, but like let's appreciate what's good around us, what we can work with. That's kind of inspiring, and then we can make it better with that future orientation.
This is interesting. One of the lines that Zoran had been sort of saying, in the run up to the election and since he won the primary, is, New Yorkers don't want their city to be a museum of the past. I think that's kind of interesting, right? But I think these in these sort of cynical and times fascist worlds, it's not just museums of the past, which at least memorialize or monumentalize something or the other. I mean, it usually is whatever the the spoils of the victors, right? That is museum-fied, so to speak. But it's actually there's a there's a there's a checking out and a sort of a withdrawal and a like I'm done with life. Like life sucks. I'm done with life. Rather than and that's so ironic because that is the position of those who have strangled and squeezed every bit of money and every resource, value, power, etc., that the planet can possibly have. So this raises the question: if you have everything and you continue to want to have everything, why would you be so down on the planet and population and species that gave you everything? Um, and I guess for me, this gets to sort of something that we've always seen, which is, you know, um, I don't know if we've always seen it, but it's like from Doctor Strangelove, right? To the desire to go to Mars. Um, it's it's sort of a very interesting kind of almost psychoanalytic coupling of winning everything and feeling like you're a complete loser in a sense.
Yeah.
That's just
Yeah.
my way of trying to make sense of this all. And not to mention that no one else is going to be allowed on Mars. And that Mars would suck anyway. But like, Gil Scott Heron told us that like, and Tribe Called Quest in their last record, First Track, right before Fife died, the space program that we're stuck here. So black people ain't going there. Women aren't going there. I don't know if Elon will go there with like all his sex bots or like what, he's already really disrespected women for a long time. Not to talk too much crap, but it's like what's up for this? So is the response to this to just sort of check in with reality, maybe one lens into reality outside of all these economic precarities, the collapse of democracy, or is actually looking under our nose and realizing we're breathing sentient beings, other human beings and non-humans like your doggy, plants, animals are also part of our chain of the web of life, and kind of getting back to what we can actually do, which is like perceive things, build with others, care for one another, care for our environment. Maybe this goes to that psychoanalytic philosophical level. I mean, that's how I was reading your work, actually.
Yeah, so interesting. I mean, everybody should listen to a space program by Tribe Called Quest because it is the Elon Musk antidote for sure.
Absolutely.
It's really great. And there's great videos. So recommended. I mean, I think one thing which Naomi and I are trying to do is develop a sort of theory of it. I mean, I do think there's something about your point that these people have everything but feel like they have nothing, and they feel like they maybe are nothing. Um, they have never encountered enoughness, and this is something I wrote about in my a book that came out in 2023 called The Age of Insecurity. And in that book, I'm trying to say that as we need to think about inequality, which we've thought a lot about thanks to the Bernie campaign, thanks to Occupy Wall Street. Inequality is really important, but that's just inequality is essentially, quantitative, right? It's the income and wealth gap. We can sort of chart inequality and see those numbers on the page, and see that 1 or 3 people has as much wealth as the bottom half of the population. Insecurity gets to the affective or emotional dimension, and that's as an organizer, it's just really important, I think, to hold that economics always has an emotional component. We cannot really talk about finance without talking about your feelings, and so insecurity is something that people feel at every level in a hyper-capitalist society because there's no ceiling and there's no floor. And so, Musk is there and he's looking at Bezos and he's looking at Zuckerberg and he's looking at whoever it is, whatever guy, is getting his goat that he's competing with. And it's a completely distorting world to be in. And it, cuts, these people, they already sort of have one foot off the planet, right? They're thinking about their exit plans, their bunkers in New Zealand, their plans to go to outer space. So they're incredibly severed from community, from reality in many ways. And I just think it's really distorting. So I know my thinking is, dispossessing, taxing billionaires out of existence is actually an act of kindness because it's not a healthy it's not a healthy way to be. These people are not well, and their wealth is a major part of the problem. Um, uh, but I think the psychoanalytic dimension is key, and I think there's a reason why after the Second World War we saw the Frankfurt School emerge, and they were trying to think. Figures like Benjamin, like Adorno, were trying to think. Marcuse, right, who's of course the villain of the right wing today, but they were trying to think Marxism and psychoanalysis together. Like, what are the sort of not just the economic forces, but the sort of libidinal? What's the libidinal economy behind these fascist movements? And I don't know, fear of death, fear of insecure masculinity. I mean, I think there are all of these unconscious forces at work, and we have to. I just think as we try to build a movement that fights back, we have to be really attuned to people's emotional lives, both the sort of ultra rich, try to understand what their motivations are and how actually irrational these paragons of capitalism tend to be, but also just the emotional lives of ordinary people, and the insecurity that's driving a lot of everyday political engagement as well. So yeah, I find myself returning to some of those kind of classic works, the Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom, right? I mean, that he was another Frankfurt School thinker who essentially said the authoritarian turn was a reaction to a kind of new democratic freedom that was available to people. And there's something there that can be kind of terrifying and disorienting about freedom for people. I think we have to contend with that and not just say, not deny that can be the case.
It's so nice because it's actually the alternative to all of this is just right there with all of us. It's what Erich Fromm wrote about so beautifully across many of his books. It's what well, Marcuse was, if I'm not mistaken, Angela Davis's advisor, and when she did her PhD, I mean, so you can see, some of the energy of Dr. Davis that is tied to this, or we see folks, like Bell Hooks or Cornel West, who's joined this podcast before and is going to be joining us again, kind of just often talking about like love and connection and being a love warrior, how like in Black music and art there's so much like love, actually. A Love Supreme by John Coltrane, Spiritual Unity, if you want to be crazier, with by Albert Ayler, Sun Ra, like kind of going into the cosmos but touching on love and connection. I'm a big music head, so there's
Sun Ra is because I can get kind of anti-space when I hear Musk and Bezos, and then I have to remember Sun Ra. Right. There's good freedom loving space.
Yeah, and seeing
space aesthetics.
And for me it actually gets to one is something that's important. Space was never supposed to be this place to run away from the here and now to, but was supposed to be this sort of agglomeration of planetary bodies and forces that inspired curiosity, cosmology and astrology and astronomy and the cosmos was seen in relation to our lives, right? When you look at many indigenous traditions, for example, space is not something to run away to and try to colonize. It's sort of seen relationally in relation to us. And so here I want to go to this question I've always been wanting to ask you, which is, I think what we see is this is sort of paradigmatically like a tension between closure, the restriction of circulation, individuation, the transformation of life into data as a kind of almost a commodified or quantified representation of life. So that's what we see on the one hand with these kind of end times fascist folks, right? Like the idea, like freezing life and compartmentalizing it and bordering, really about bordering. Right. And the reason why this podcast is called Utopias is it's a North Star vision of a world and life that is more borderless and more relational. I know I'm being pretty philosophical here. Yeah. But it's like moving out of the bunker and recognizing that, like, Doug Rushkoff says in Team Human, right? Like, he's my buddy, like life's being human's a team sport. That's like one way of putting it. For me, it's also like, it's even what Jodorowsky says, right? Like, what's the point of life? It's life, right? It's so maybe the solution to this that all of us can draw upon is just actually recognizing that we are social beings and we need to reconnect with ourselves, reconnect with one another, reconnect with the planet. And by the way, that's like awesome and fun and inspiring. Wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think what to add to that. You know, and I think this is a little bit beyond the piece I wrote with Naomi, but it's a bit in there. I mean, I think our conception also has to be more than human. I mean, it has to be truly sort of multi-species. So one you know quip we make in Must Direction is he's so fixated on being multi-planetary, right? And it's like, well, I'd rather live on a multi-species planet. Like we have all of this miraculous life around us, and so there's part of the problem with this colonizer conquering view of space, right, is this human supremacy. We're going to go out there, and it's instead of a kind of humble, curious, open-minded view. And I guess I would just say, though, we can help people orient in that more curious, compassionate, cooperative way, that more sort of team human way, by building a material foundation that provides a kind of security for folks to do that. And when we look at how it is that the United States did not descend into fascism in the 20th century, it wasn't just because there was some sort of unique American spirit. There were fascists all over this country. Famously, right, the massive rally at Madison Square Garden, or the revival in the 20s of the Ku Klux Klan. What happened was ultimately, there were policies put in place that mitigated inequality, and they were imperfect. We can make all of our critiques of the New Deal era that we want to make, and we should, because we shouldn't repeat those mistakes. But ultimately, if you read historians like Nancy MacLean, writing about the KKK, for example, what disbanded that iteration of it was like the rise of labor unions and better jobs and better wages and material transformations that gave people a sense of security, again, that allowed them to feel a bit more brave and open-minded. And this is stuff that is backed up by social science research, right? That a kind of baseline of material security helps people have some of these characteristics that we associate with like good liberalism, right? Tolerance, open-mindedness, willingness to engage with diversity and all of that. So, I think balancing, again, the sort of material and the emotional, and also what Naomi and I are calling in the piece kind of mythic, right? That we need to also make people feel called to stories, to be part of a movement, a mission that would fight for these things. We need all of those elements.
I love that the mythic part of it, because it's all about, looking for stories, looking for examples, looking for those we can relate to. And I also just really want to emphasize how important it is that you point out insecurity, in your book, like about security, and that feeling of security, which is not just a quantitative thing, it's something people feel. And when we as human beings in all aspects of our lives, all of our listeners, feel secure about this, that, and the other, it actually gives us the capacity to do so much more, right? It's because anxiety and precarity are so draining on our energy, on our resources, on our emotions, on our bodies, on our minds. It's beautifully said. So, I, of course, want to, speaking of imagining a different world, a different future, here I want to just bring back David Graeber, right? Rest in power forever. And, I know you must have been both personally connected to David, as well as worked with him in the context of Occupy Wall Street and with the Debt Collective. So Graeber makes this beautiful point that, like, debt is a relationship of power. Indebtedness is a social relationship, a relationship of feeling servitude, in a sense, which again is the biggest drain on our ability to flourish, our ability to thrive. So let me just ask you a little bit about your own connections, your own history in working as an organizer within Occupy, and what led to the formation of the Debt Collective. And then I wanted to share with you a little bit about some of my own students and how important what you all are doing is for so many of my students present and past, and I know future.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, David Graeber was a friend of mine, and was the person who sort of cajoled me into going down to Occupy Wall Street. And Occupy kicked off in September of 2011. So he had published his monumental book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, not long before that. And he moved to London soon after, but he was definitely a kind of instigator of the group of folks that would become the Debt Collective. I've often joked that he sort of got the band together, like he sort of handpicked the people that he wanted to have collaborate on this thing. And here we are, many years later, still working on it. I'll also say that my work as an organizer is actually sort of core. It drives a lot of my writing. So my thinking on democracy, my thinking about insecurity, my ideas tend to be generated through organizing. And I just think it's important to say that, because I think people kind of have a default scenario where it's like ideas first, action second, right? As though action is unthinking. It's just the sort of mechanical implementation of theory. And I don't find it to be that way at all. I find it to be, when you're engaging with other people, when you're engaging with power structures, you're learning, you're testing your ideas against other humans, against political institutions, and it tremendous opportunity to kind of generate ideas. I think a lot of our best ideas, at least in the social and political and philosophical realms, have actually come from movements and percolated up to the sort of more theoretical sphere. So the Debt Collective is an experimental union of debtors. We're inspired by the labor movement. We're inspired by tenants unions. It's essentially that we're all in the economy, and we need associations that enable us to enact forms of economic power and to act collectively. And in the New Deal era, we began to build up an American welfare state. It was imperfect, it was flawed, it was very racist in many ways. It had a lot of race and gendered exclusions, but nevertheless, it's the bedrock of a kind of system of social provision. And starting in the late 70s, 80s, that has been chipped away at. Increasingly, people have to debt finance their basic needs. So student loans really started to explode in the late 90s and aughts, and they are a product of the fact that we don't have public free college, right? We have 100 million people with medical debt in this country. Why? Because we don't have universal healthcare. People in Canada do not have medical debt. People in France do not have medical debt. And so we see debt as a symptom of a lack of public goods. And so part of the appeal of debtor organizing to me is that the idea is, we can fight for the abolition, for the cancellation of these unjust debts. Nobody should have to go into debt for healthcare, for education, for housing, for food, right? And of course we have to go into debt when we're paid sub-living wages. But we solve that not just by canceling debts, but by building the political power to win democratic, what we call reparative public goods. And we call them reparative to say, they have to be structured in a way that addresses inequalities, that addresses past harms, and they can't just be based on the sort of New Deal model of the past. We have to kind of reimagine them. So we have really led the charge for the cancellation of student debt and for free college. When we first started raising these demands back in 2012, there's an article in Reuters, there's an article in NPR, and they were like, basically, we're like, look at these clowns from Occupy Wall Street want debt cancellation and free stuff. And, one of them even said, the government will never cancel debt. And well, we have not won everything we wanted, and we are very battered and bruised as a result of the last decade of organizing. Under the Biden administration, $200 billion of student debt was canceled for over 5 million people. And that is not nothing. I know that we changed a whole lot of lives. We've organized thousands and thousands and thousands of debtors. We have protested. We have gone on debt strikes. We have petitioned. We have marched. We have done civil disobedience. We have written policy papers. We have researched the law and found the legal mechanisms that the government can use. We have done the homework of our legislatures for years on end to get to a point where we made this idea part of the American kind of vernacular, right? It's now common sense. Everybody knows debt cancellation exists, and now it's a pretty intense political football with the current administration. So, and for me, it was a huge learning opportunity. It was like, wow, how do you win something? How do you organize? How does government actually work? um, and now we've expanded the union, the organizations. We're working on. We work very closely with the Los Angeles tenants unions. We're organizing a rent strike in California. We are working on issues of healthcare and medical debt, especially in this moment as they're cutting Medicaid. We also work on school lunch debt. But basically, the Trump administration, by devastating people's economic lives, is driving more and more people into debt. And we want people to know they don't have to suffer alone, that there's, they can come to the debt collective, find solidarity, and hopefully find strategies that, if we stick with it, can help us fight fascism, because I actually think that's what this is about.
Yeah, it's also what so many younger folks in our country are enraged about and want alternatives to. And we see a lot of that, in the New York case, in the support of Zoran Mamdani. We saw it with younger people and their love of Bernie, despite Bernie being 83 years old, how well he related to younger people, because he was, and both of them are and were and will continue to fight for a future that doesn't disenfranchise and harm the youngest of us and those who are going to be leading us forward. I have a number of students, Astra, who I've been talking to, both alums of UCLA, right, which is like a top university, and current students who are in such profound amounts of student debt that they have two choices. Either they try to take what's left of some sort of like corporate Wall Street-ish or big tech type of job, which those jobs are being drained as we speak because of corporate and privatized driven AI, which uses all our data. By the way, we're getting there after this. Or they are doing gig work, which is also likely to be replaced and is fueling AI systems, right? They call it human augmented AI, like gig workers driving for Uber and so on. These are graduates from UCLA, right? So this is like very privileged institution. And this is actually astonishing, given that countries that are even close to as wealthy as ours, almost all of them across the board, universities and colleges are free or quite minimal cost. Like we're talking like 1/20th, 1/50th in many cases the cost. I mean, you know this better than I. So it's kind of like when I'm looking at all that again, I see the end times fascism raising its head. Like it's sort of like the foreclosure of life, the foreclosure of a home, the foreclosure of your mortgage, right? Therefore, the foreclosure of your life, something that Judith Butler's talked about, the foreclosuring of life. So it's sort of like, on the one hand, you have that, and on the other hand, you have these forms of organizing that kind of present what a different today and tomorrow could look like. I guess I want to ask that all. That's just a setup for now we're seeing a massive assault by this administration on international students and on what universities like from international students, which is very high tuition rates. And it's a point that actually a large part of our economy in the United States is tied to so-called educational tourism. So we see a government that's not only closing the doors and freaking everybody out from coming here as tourists, but also coming here as international students. And I guess I want to talk about that. In a sense, that seems to be detonating the entire project of that administration itself, unless the entire project, the administration, is just to close all doors, close all borders, and freak everybody out and essentially destroy the economy. And I'm just wondering what you think of that point too, like the kind of irony and paradox where we see neo-fascism actually build on neoliberalism, but actually destroy neoliberalism and, in a sense, its own foundation.
Yeah, I mean it's cannibalistic, right? It makes me think of Nancy Fraser's concept of
Cannibalistic. That's the word. Cannibalistic.
cannibal capitalism, but we've entered a phase of capitalism where just eating itself. And this gets to the point I was making about MAGA and this sort of this framing of things in such existential terms, right? That I mean, and if you read sort of popular right-wing books, I mean, there's this constant refrain of like, the social movements post 1960s have taken over America, but especially the academy, and they are destroying America from within. And there is no way to reform these institutions. They have to be destroyed. And I don't know if you remember the fellow who is one of the architects of Project 2025, wrote a book. There was a big scandal over it because the subtitle was something like "Burning Down Washington to Save It." It was this sort of arsonist politics, right? We've got to burn down the institutions. That's the idea of sort of Doge. That things are sort of unsalvageable, and so let's destroy them, except for the punitive capacities of the state. Those we can put a bunch of money in. So now we have massive increase of funding for ICE and Border Patrol and the like. I think the academy is really interesting, and it is an area where I spend a lot of time because the Debt Collective has never been, again, we've never just been about canceling student debt. We have been about the provision of free public education for everybody at all phases of life, for lifelong learning subsidized by the state. One of my favorite quotes is a quote from Ronald Reagan when he was the governor of California, and he actually began the sort of war on free college because when he was governor in the 1960s, the University of California was the crown jewel of the nation. It was free. And he said, the state shouldn't be in the business of subsidizing curiosity, right? And so I think one way to frame what the Debt Collective is fighting for is a world where the state does subsidize curiosity, where that is seen as something worth doing. And that's so different than AI, right? Which is all about outsourcing, questioning, answering, thinking to a computer. It's like, no, this is such innately human work. We should actually be supported. We should be given the time and resources to do it ourselves, because that to me is really one thing that is central to what it is to be alive, to be a Homo sapien. In any case, I think on the university front, if you read Project 2025, which I recommend people do, and you read the education chapter specifically about higher ed, they're basically very clear. They're like, we're going to decimate higher education through multiple tactics. And one is destroying the student lending system, because right now, the fact is we have a debt finance model of funding education, and they see the power in that. So if they can not just get rid of student loan forgiveness, but actually privatize student lending, it will shrink the number of students who are willing to go to college, because they will understand that it'll be more financially ruinous, and also poorer students will not make the cut for these lenders. They talk about going after DEI programs. They talk about going after academic research money, so the way that they've defunded research grants, and then going after international students is another prong. So they're very strategically, very brilliantly going after these revenue streams that subsidize higher education, and so the Debt Collective is working closely with groups like the AUP, which is the American Association of University Professors, with Higher Education Labor United, which is HELU, to try to build a coalition that is saying, no to this, and actually saying, we don't want a restoration of the academy we had 5 years ago. We want a new public, small d democratic model. And I think this is a moment when that has to be the sort of horizon, the utopian horizon we're fighting for. There are things that are really worrying me. So, for example, yesterday there was a story in the New York Times about AFT, which is the American Federation of Teachers, which is the biggest teachers union, announcing a big collaboration with OpenAI and Microsoft to show educators how to use AI in the classroom. And it's just like aligning with the end times fascists, in hopes that they might sort of spare you or lay you off a bit later or something like that. I think it's the wrong approach. I think we need a sort of very human oriented defense of learning, of the right to learn, and of the need for state investment in that enterprise. And the last thing I'll say in terms of a war on the future, I mean, you can't get kind of more on the nose than destroying education, because what is education except an act of faith in the future, that there's something valuable about passing on wisdom, passing on techniques of research, that we are part of a multi-generational endeavor to learn about our world. And these people are basically like, they're just saying, fuck it, right? Like, fuck it, and a company, these big tech companies have really been parasitic on the academy. They have benefited a lot from scientific research, from engineering research, from research into AI. And essentially, they don't like the academic ethos anymore. It's contrary to their business model. And so what they'd like to do is be able to buy up all that talent, take it into the private sector, and get rid of and get rid of the academy, because it's no longer serving their business needs. And so that's part of, you've got this unholy alliance of like the religious right hating public education, the corporate America wanting to privatize it, and big tech going, hey, we've extracted everything we need right now. Let's let LLMs do all the thinking from here until the end of time.
Yeah, that's a common thread. Attacks on curiosity, attacks on creativity, and attacks on security, right? Yeah. Hence capitalism and insecurity machine, right? It's like you can't be curious, which is like being curious is like the most fun thing, like, or for me at least, about being a living human being. And just like you, I draw all my ability to be a writer and a thinker and be curious from working with different communities and working with different movements. I mean, I haven't been front lines the way you have, but like, I remember at one point I met you through my friend Peter Bloom, who's a badass organizer in Oaxaca, like working now on the Amazon, working all over the planet, like these. And I used to be in the part of the Arab Spring, like writing for Al Jazeera and doing my scholarly work there, looking at how those revolutions occurred. That's how we learn things. That's what generates curiosity. So it seems like that's why Eric Fromm is also so important. An attack on the spirit seems to be such a big part of this. So in a way, what what you all are attempting to do, the Debt Collective, is kind of liberate people's spirits, liberate people's security, liberate people's curiosity, especially younger people who have no fault in any of this occurring. Yeah. So very practical question, like how can we all help and support the Debt Collective and all that it stands for? And are there other, also, I know there are many organizations and initiatives that we can like all get into and get behind, because I come, our conversation is getting me really excited and curious, actually.
Yeah, I mean, people often ask me at talks or events, what can I do to help save democracy? And my response is always, it's a we enterprise, right? So the first thing is to join some kind of group. And that is the difference between being an activist and an organizer. So you can be an activist alone, you can sound the alarm about something, you can raise awareness, you can go on a one-person hunger strike, but an organizer implies you're organizing with others. You're trying to get in formation, get in alignment. You're trying to build a coalition. Maybe you're building an organization that maybe you could help start it, but then it persists without you because we're bigger than ourselves. And that's how you build power. So I think my main piece of advice always is, find a place where you can be part of a we. And I think, academics need to get really serious, like this moment. And I come from a family of, my dad's a professor, my sister's a prof, but it's like, y'all are not stepping up. Like the house is on fire. Like the house is on fire. Get it together. Like, join AUP, join HELU, join, try to build not just with your immediate colleagues, but a wall-to-wall union. You got to get the dining staff in there along with adjuncts, along with the tenured folks. So that's important. I mean, definitely want people to join the Debt Collective. I think Indivisible is really impressing me this time around. DSA, I think, is always a great thing to join. So I do think it's really important to join something. And I think it's, to your point about curiosity, I was just reading a piece in The Atlantic about the AI AI debates, and I can't remember who it was, but it was one of these entrepreneurs and one of these AI guys in his quote, and he said, well, I just don't know about school anymore because AI is so much smarter than my teenager. And I was like, God, you never feel like the calculator does better math than my kid. So I'm not going to, educate my human child. Like, these people are demented. I mean, that's demented. And there's so much, there's, I think there's just such a rich case to be made for education, not in an instrumental fashion, not just as because we need educated citizens for democracy to function, or because we need an educated workforce for the economy to function, but because this is what it is to be human. Because curiosity, as you said, is like one of the greatest unsung pleasures of being alive. And I think that would resonate with people. I think if we went out there and said, and everybody should have the right to that, whether you're poor or middle class, shouldn't be something that's just for the rich. I just think, just like the Mamdani campaign, saying, affordability, like let's take what we have and make it better and more beautiful. I think it's the kind of message that people want to hear. And when we start orienting our movements towards visions like that, I actually think that people will join us, and we'll find that we actually have potentially, that popularity and that power that we were talking about.
I mean, a huge part of being human is being curious. A huge part of education is being curious and learning and trying things out and playing with things and playing with one another and just exploring, right? And like that's why I'm part of a university, because I truly learn with and from so-called my students. I'm not even sure who's the teacher and who's the student sometimes, right? Like we're all just like collectively exploring and learning, and that involves disagreement and at times, which is great. Um, it's so now to tech and AI. I was setting ourselves up, of course, because it's what I work on a lot, and I know you know a lot about it. Um, okay, so 10 to 15 years ago, there was robust debate, that and many actually like were, including very like well-regarded folks, were sort of saying, hey, now with social media and tech kind of expanding and kind of being in all of our hands with thanks to these phones, which might be Trojan horses, really. We can, here comes everybody. That's Clay Shirky. Or like, or yeah, I don't, he wasn't ever my favorite, but like other folks too. Yochai Benkler at Harvard was saying, oh, well, look, Wikipedia is badass. And like, Wikipedia is better than an elite Encyclopedia Britannica, sort of a kind of a legacy of elites. And now everybody knows that these social media companies are deeply dysfunctional. But the bigger story, whether it's social media or it's AI or really anything, is that all of this is on an internet that we all paid for. I know in 1969, Bolter Hall on my campus, the ARPANET, U.S. taxpayers paid for this internet, yet U.S. taxpayers get little to nothing from all these companies that would be worthless without the internet. But more maybe relevantly for today, none of it's worth anything without our data. And the idea of these systems, many of these systems are attempting to, again, being psychoanalytic, construct desire and, very Lacan, and influence behavior and just overwhelm us, where like, it feels like the future is just constantly like crushing us in the face. And they also erase history. They're really the end of history because they're using past data, but not history, like a little bit of data from the past. And are all built, especially generative AI, are all built around this incredibly flawed intellectual premise that correlation or pattern recognition is the basis of knowledge production. And that intelligence is merely pattern recognition. But of course, those patterns are those drawn by and for elites. So it's like there's an incredible reduction in humanity, and I would say the noopolitical, the energy of life, toward the necropolitical that is tied to these technologies. So I guess I want to just start engaging you around this question, right? We can see, of course, there are possibilities for AI systems to be catalysts in our writing or our art making or a creative practice. But boy, as reservoirs or replacements or containers of knowledge, they're none of those things. So I would just wonder what you think about that.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to think back to that enthusiastic discourse, right? The the days when it was like the Twitter revolution and the Facebook revolution. And I always was so struck by the fact that the folks writing those kinds of things, the Clay Shirkies and others, were always willing to critique authoritarian governments abroad, but not willing to critique capitalism, not willing to critique the authoritarian elements of our political system. And then you would look at the back of their books and they go, oh, they've given talks at Nokia and Microsoft. And, it's like, okay, you're on the corporate lecture circuit. Like, I get it. That's where your butter, that's what's butter in your bread, And what was missing from all that hype was just a basic rudimentary sense of political economy. Like, these people had never read Marx or never read economics from a kind of progressive perspective, it seems.
Or the Frankfurt School, right?
The Frankfurt School. And so they would go, gosh, we love Wikipedia. Wikipedia is so great. But like, Wikipedia was never the whole internet. I mean, Wikipedia is the exception that proves the rule. And I love Wikipedia. I donate monthly to it. I have it on, on schedule. And it's a nonprofit. It's like, it is this very unique outpost. And it's so interesting to watch the movie repeat with the AI discourse. So if you go back, I'm sure you know this well, I wrote about it in my book, The People's Platform. If you go back to the early days of Google, there's a sort of famous letter that the founders wrote where they're like, because Google came out of academia. So as you said, the internet's a public creation. And then a lot of later research, was publicly funded and also housed in academic institutions. So anyway, the founders of Google write this letter that's like, wow, we just know a commercial search engine is never going to show people stuff that's actually good because there's an antithetical element between an ad-driven model and a model that's geared towards quality and truth. Well, what they realized? They realized that might be true in principle, but it's not going to pay the bills, and it's certainly not going to make them, a $1 trillion company. And so with OpenAI, so what we have is Google going totally corporate. With OpenAI, we have something similar, right? It begins as a nonprofit, and they say if you read the mission, we're helping humanity with our nonprofit AI. And then what happens? They realize that they're not going to be able to scale up, which is their favorite word, scale, unless they figure out how to morph into a corporate structure. And so that element of, who owns the back end, who owns the machines, who owns the robots, who owns the large language learning models, whatever. Like, these are the questions that it just felt for years were like always pushed, always repressed and that we need to face. And it's getting harder and harder to tackle them, though, as these companies get bigger and bigger. I mean, we just had we as of last week have our first $4 trillion company on this planet, and it is a chip manufacturer. Why? Because Wall Street is saying we're going to be making a lot of chips because we're going to be making a lot of data centers for the AI revolution. And as you just said, this is a revolution that a lot of it is bunk. It's on this built on this totally false idea of what intelligence is. It's based on stolen data. It's basically Wikipedia plus all of our books plus like the dark web, just to add more racism and grotesque misogyny in there. And none of us are asking for it. And the environmental and economic consequences are going to be so incredibly dire. But I think the question through all of this and through all the debates about tech, fundamentally, I think this question of ownership is key. And the tech industry always speaks in the language of inevitability, right? So it's like, you're just a Luddite, or you're just a old fogey saying, get off my lawn if you don't like ChatGPT, and it's like, actually, it's not inevitable that you own the world. It's just more likely than me owning the world because you're already a billionaire, and therefore it's easy for you to get richer and richer and richer and richer. Yeah, but it's there's something, it's painful about kind of hearing these debates again, because, those utopian claims from that period, which is now 15 years ago, were debunked, right? And then it felt like we got to a point where we were like, actually, if anything, had gone into a very negative view of social media, a very negative view, like, social media went from being the hero to being the demon. It was like, no, let's talk about it as something material and sociological that we could change. And now we're kind of doing it again with AI. It's like, oh, wow, it's just amazing super intelligence. And, oh, it's a demon. It's like, no, it's something that humans are constructing. Like, let's get our hands on it and build it, because there's some elements I think that could be really useful. I'd love to have free green buses a la Mamdani that are maybe assisted with machine learning so that they can figure out the most fuel efficient route or something like that. I mean, I can imagine uses for these tools, but they're just so mystified. The phrase artificial intelligence is just like such a mystifying, misleading phrase. I hate it.
Because it's not it's incredibly a reductive view into what intelligence is, right? And there are certain questions where everyone can agree, we wanted the most efficient route, to minimize time, that we call them deterministic questions. Those are quantitative optimizable questions, but those are I would say less than 1/100th of 1% of the questions we ask and engage with as human beings, right? So it's an incredibly reductive way of actually replacing curiosity and knowledge making and all of this. So if we you've said it now twice, and I think this is just really important, and it's incredible. Like, I use the same words actually as you in so many ways. It's like a lot of these folks, these transhumanists who are sort of driving AI and big tech, we've already talked about their bunkering and their desire to get out of here and their lack of interest in humanity or women or pretty much anybody else. One of them, by the way, who I went to college with, who's in the Trump cabinet. We'll talk about that, one-on-one later. Used to ask me, I mean, I got him into the talking heads, I remember, in college. I was a college radio DJ. We got to talk about that too. But it's like, and then he would be like, why do women have a dorm? Or like, why is there a women's studies class? I mean, literally, you could juxtapose these two with one another, and you see sort of, he likes the talking heads because I got him into it, but then he's sort of like, why is there a Black Students Association? Literally, these are things that were being said to me. So it's sort of like, if you have such a closed view of life, of humanity, of one another, should you really be the one driving these AI systems? And all of these folks seem to be obsessed with, the Terminator scenario, which they're actively trying to build, by the way. So why would you be so freaked out about a scenario? You treat something as inevitable that you are the one socially constructing and no one else is. And by the way, you're only talking about the Terminator scenario rather than the ways in which it's depriving us of curiosity, of creative. It's discriminating against the poor. It's disastrous for the environment, disastrous for labor. Why is there this kind of fetish? I think it's a fetish of Terminator type stuff. Is it just too many sci-fi movies when these guys were kids? Yet they're actually creating the disastrous inevitable that they fear. What's up with that in your mind? And I know you touched on this in the End Times piece as well.
Yeah. I'm really curious what you think is up with these guys, because I'm confused. I mean, we're speaking a couple of days after Elon Musk's AI Grok went full Nazi because he programmed it to be less woke, and it was almost comedic in its darkness, right? That's what it takes for these systems, is someone going in there and turning the dial a bit, and suddenly it speaks like an evil gremlin from a 1980s movie or something like that. It's very weird. But I mean, what Naomi and I argue is that there are very old scripts. This is why myth is really important. There are very old myths in our society, and going back to those myths of Armageddon, right? Of world destruction, of apocalypse. I mean, these are myths that are foundational to a Judeo-Christian worldview, and they manifest and are improvised with in our media, in our culture. And they're like ready-mades, right? Pete, they're just there for the taking. I mean, there's the famous Frederick Jameson line that says it's easier to imagine the end of life on Earth than the end of capitalism. And that's something that's always really resonated with me, right? I mean, destruction it's almost like there's almost something that's elemental about it. It is easier to destroy something than to build. I mean, I can destroy in an instant something that I don't have the capacity to regenerate, so there's something um there's something kind of primal about that. I don't know. I mean, I think there's so many factors feeding into this. When I look at these guys and how thin-skinned they are, I think there's some real status anxiety, despite the fact they're billionaires. The fact that there have been social movements over the last decade saying, "Hey, you're privileged." You also have to pay attention to. Maybe you should listen to the stories of people who are marginalized. Maybe you should take yourself down a notch. Like, their response to this was just so over the top, so aggrieved, so angry. I mean, if you read the accounts, for example, of I mean, Musk was always very weird in his politics, but he's very triggered by the fact that workers were organizing at his factories, at Tesla factories, and that there was some race critique in there as well. It was they wanted better wages and they wanted working conditions that weren't racist, and he flipped out. Workers were also organizing at Google against Project Maven, against the War Machine. This really angered these people, and helped trigger this very irrational response that is rational and that's aligned with their business interests, right? I mean, because they're like, because there is a kind of inherent contradiction to the idea of woke capitalism. So I don't know. There's a lot going on there. I mean, their business model is a kind of Alex Carp from Palantir said the other day, bad times are good for business, or we're a business built for bad times. I mean, or I'm thinking about a recent quote from Mark Zuckerberg. I'm sure you saw it, where he said, hey, there's a loneliness epidemic. People only have 3 friends, but they have demand for 15. And so we'll make bots to be their friends. It's like, this guy sees people's isolation, their alienation, their loneliness as an opportunity for him to sell virtual human companionship. So there's just something very, I don't know, man. I don't have a full coherent theory. I look at these guys and I'm like, you need therapy. Like, you don't need more money. You need therapy.
And it's perhaps because many of them feel so much loneliness. I mean, here's my compassionate Buddhist side just a little bit coming out. It's and it's sort of notable also how the best of Judeo-Christian values have been sort of pushed out of the experience. I was at a silent retreat like 2 weeks ago at a Jesuit monastery where the female monks would, during mass, the only time they would speak, I'm not Christian either, would talk about Gaza, or how, Cory Doctorow, who I brought on to this podcast, we'll be releasing that one soon, who's quite a character. I bet Cory. Yeah. Was talking about how like tech workers actually they read cyberpunk, and they read cyberpunk being like, this is not the world we want, and believed in the internet and the capacity to use digital technology to overcome hierarchies, to overcome the stifling nature of power, and how they hate what's going on. And so I think all these are tied to what your comments. I just think it's sort of this. It's a very, very strange time where a very limited slice of humanity, I know this has existed throughout history, but as you said, it always takes on new forms, are so disconnected. Like, the connectors are the most disconnected. And the disconnection maybe starts at youth, but it's definitely a disconnection from wanting to deal with the messiness of what life is. But the messiness is actually the joy, right? The messiness is the joy. It's the curiosity. Gosh, so now to just like, now we're like staring at generative AI, like, what some people are saying, and I love saying this, is that we don't want to go down the same path with generative AI that we've gone down with social media and so many other things, right? As I'm sure you were following, in this disgusting bill that just got through, there was a provision that Ted Cruz put in that the House passed, saying that no state government could regulate AI, any of these AI companies that themselves really don't want to be regulated, obviously. And Eric Schmidt, people like that say, we've designed it. We're the only ones who will know anything about it. That's a design strategy, by the way. We're the only ones who are going to know anything about it. So no one else can actually know enough about it to regulate it. That's called designing for deception. That's what we call that. Yeah. Luckily, this is so weird. The Senate voted 99-1 to take out that clause. That's a very strange moment where like something good happened, and for their own weird reasons, Republicans, but even Democrats voted against it. So I just was at the California State Assembly, like talking about all the things we could do about AI. And it started with what you just said earlier, which is actually visualizing. You use the term externalities, if I'm not mistaken, like basically, or at the minimum, let's just like look at what these AI systems are taking and giving, right? Like in a wider lens, drinking water sources, energy sources, right? This is something that Karen Howe is pointing out in her book Empire of AI. Our data, our attention, our maybe the hormones in our brains are actually raw materials of digital capitalism, like dopamine, cortisol, adrenaline, our time. Like what are the inputs and what are the outputs, and who owns the means of production, as you talked about with political economy, and also how could, by opening up so we see all of it, like in a true literacy program, can we design these kinds of systems, because in lots of different ways, right? Collaborative design and audit and stakeholder, these are things Kathy O'Neill has pointed out in her books from way back, like Weapons of Math Destruction, right? So it's like there could be, what could be done in your mind to lift the hood off this thing right here and now, so we have real literacy around it, so that actually we can collaboratively take this forward in a way, this being generative AI, in a way that actually can support like what you and I believe in, which is something that's truly democratic and more equitable.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. I'd be curious to know what kind of stuff you're saying to the assembly, and get into the details if you can ever share that kind of stuff.
Of course. Oh no, I can totally share about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm because I'm interested in these questions. I think right now it's built on the commons, right? It's built on knowledge and images and language from all of us. And so I think there does need to be some kind of public stake in this technology. But I also think we really need to be like, do we want to build this? I mean, the energy demands, what you're saying about the incredible use of potable water, the incredible strain it's going to put on energy grids, the fact that it is right now causing this return to dirty energy sources. They've revived 3 Mile Island, for example, to create another energy source. I mean, I think it's not just about a public dividend from it. I think it's really, we have to figure out, in an ideal world, this is getting a little bit pie in the sky of like, do we really want to go down this road at all? And are there ways to have, some of these tools, but, not on remote server farms, not at remote data centers, but maybe, we could have them on our own laptops or our own phones, so that we're not using as much energy in them. I mean, I think, if I could, I'm trying to think about ways we could actually get to our demands. I think it would be really interesting to have things like citizens assemblies about this. I'd love to know what the public, if they were called into some forum and given given information and able to deliberate, what they would come up with. Because as you said, I mean, I was watching that provision in the reconciliation bill really closely, and they stripped it out because right wingers, and I'm talking about the base, like MAGA people, did not like it. They don't like those techno-feudalists. They also didn't like the sale of public lands. So 1.2 million acres of public lands were up for sale. And many MAGA aligned folks made it known that they really resisted that. So that hints that, anyway, that shows me that there's a kind of public alignment, right? A kind of space for a populist anti-tech movement. And this is why I think, AFT, American Federation of Teachers, like, getting in bed with OpenAI at this moment is such a misstep, because I can see, parents of kids, K through 12, not wanting AI in the classroom, right? Not wanting the techno-feudalists to control their children's learning. So yeah, I think right now we just lack the mechanisms for that kind of public deliberation. I would love to see it. I mean, there are some experiments with citizens assemblies, which is where the public is kind of called up, and there's a kind of coordinated opportunity for folks who kind of represent the people writ large to come to determinations on things. I mean, this has happened in Ireland. It's happened in France. There's some experiments playing out right now or getting started in New York. But it's like, we can't have a democratic outcome without a democratic process. And that process is so thoroughly lacking in this moment. And I think to even get there, this is why this sort of public conversation where it's like AI is either God or demon, right? Like it's either gonna save the world or else it's AGI is gonna destroy us because it'll be the super intelligence that hates us and is like not helping us, because what we need to be talking about is, again, what resources are being extracted, who owns the results, why are they so dead set on building this technology that nobody's asking for? Because those talking about that stuff, the real immediate harms to people's livelihoods, to their to their air, to their water, I think would produce a very different kind of conversation and different political solutions.
Yeah, and neither and just talking about the Terminator scenario is actually, I think it's a strategy to keep everybody in the dark.
I agree. I totally agree.
And strip everybody of agency.
And it's just well, to your point about it being this, I really like your phrase designing for deception, because this, like, no one else can understand this line was, guess who said that all the time? Wall Street. That was the line of the financial sector leading up to financial crisis, right? That was Enron, the smartest guys in the room. I mean, these folks are always mystifying their domain as a strategy to keep ordinary people from asking questions and basically seeing that it's snake oil.
Yeah, and we actually brought on one of the authors of the very good book AI Snake Oil. That's the next episode that we're going to put out, written by two computer scientists at Princeton, but who are asking really, really good questions. They may not be as politically explicit as you and I, but they're right there with us on and that's important. That this designing for deception. We just have a huge opportunity to actually do what you actually mentioned, which is actually the way we get agency, is recognizing that it's never about technology. It should never, ever, it being life. It should never be about technology. One thing that technologists tend to do, and you know this, I've read the People's Platform as well. And you know this, they love to throw technology at problems caused by other technologies.
Totally.
This is like the techno solutionist, that's the term Evgeny Morozov and other people have used. It's like that's the techno solutionist approach. It's like it's never really about what actually matters, which are the voices and the values of all of us living beings, not just humans, non-humans too, right? As you said. It's like so actually, like, my 2 cents on this, to what you kind of asked me earlier, is to actually create assemblies and let's actually have dialogues. But what we need to do first and foremost is have everybody wrap their heads around and try to understand what's going on, which is actually pretty easy to explain in a very qualitative way to people who don't, want to get into the math and the linear algebra of all of it. And there's so much we can do around it. So, like, for me, I'm actually very excited about the possibility of you and I and all our friends and organizers working together to try to push this, because yes, from MAGA to pretty much everybody else, they don't want this. And I remember this, Astra, when I was a student at the Media Lab at MIT. I was weirded out by the Media Lab in lots of ways. We can talk about that the next time we chat. But I was sort of responsible for building software that grassroots communities could use to publish on. That was basically, like, we called it citizen journalism at that time. I mean, you remember that. That was what I was trying to do. But I remember, and we were forced to take all these classes and weren't very interesting. My classes outside of the Media Lab were much more interesting than my classes in. But I remember in one of them, we were basically forced to design a robot that kind of looked like Furby. And I've talked to my students about this, and we would bring it into nursing homes and childcare centers, and they would be like, "Get that the F away from me." And it just spoke to how even I, at that time, as a very progressive graduate student, but not even me, just that world was so disconnected from realities. But guess what? Those realities of all those people and their voices are right there in front of us. So let's bring them back to the surface right now. Yeah. Sorry, that was a rant, but it was just I needed to say that.
No Furbies. Like, how about good paying jobs for human caretakers?
Exactly. So, all right, two last questions. And I know we're like we've gone a long time, but all right. So first one is I want to ask you also about kind of what kind of inspired you to be an organizer. And I know you're also an artist and a musician, and I've seen I don't know if you played with Neutral Milk Hotel, but
I
I
did.
saw
Yep.
Neutral Milk Hotel in the late 90s, I remember,
Oh, not
like
then. Yeah, I played
at like
later. Yeah,
at like
that's
punk
awesome.
DIY venues in
Hmm.
the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where I am and where I'm from right now. Um, and so like tell me a
Probably
little
the
bit
bottom
about
of the hill.
at the bottom of the hill. That's where I
Yep.
mean I saw Pavement back in the day, the Pixies, I saw Dinosaur Jr., I saw Sonic Youth there. I mean, you know how small the bottom of the hill is. I saw Fugazi there. I saw The Fall there. I mean, I just can keep going. And in this podcast, by the way, I'm bringing on punks and hip hop artists. Kathleen Hanna already joined us last year, and that was from Bikini Kill and La Tigra, and that was really cool.
You should
Um,
have Damon Kurkowski from Galaxy 500 on, who's written
oh,
some
that would
great
be
books I
great.
know you would like. Yeah.
I'll ask you for that
Yeah.
connection. I love Galaxy 500. Galaxy 500 became Luna. Is that right? Or was that?
And yeah, Luna and then Damon and Naomi.
Oh yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, Damon and Naomi. That's right, right. So tell me a little bit about like the arts and music and the poetic side, and how has that influenced your life? And I know your husband's also in Neutral Milk Hotel, or maybe the founder of that band.
Hmm.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about that, and what does music and art mean to you then, now, today, in the future?
Yeah, it's always hard to identify like why am I the way I am? I don't know. I've definitely always had an activist streak. I'm one of those kids. My first memory is becoming vegetarian and being, incensed when another kid told me I eat animals. So I've definitely always had a kind of very moralizing personality on some level. But I think a lot of my kind of interdisciplinary approach can actually be traced to growing up in Athens, Georgia. So I'm Canadian, but I grew up in Athens, Georgia, which is um, sort of college town in the South, famous for having been the home of the B-52s and REM, and also Elephant Six, so which is the larger musical collective that
And
gave rise.
Pylon. I love Pylon.
Yeah, Pylon, exactly. So Elephant Six gave rise to Nutrimoco Hotel and Olivia Tremor Control. And in Athens, growing up, um, uh, there was like a towny scene. Everybody was an artist, and it was totally cool. You could be a really serious musician or a really serious painter or a really serious sculptor and work at a restaurant, right? I mean, and that was how you paid your bills. And then you'd go on tour, you'd make your art, and it was totally fine. You were someone who um, was that creative thing you were doing. And I think I have taken a little bit of that into the realm of being an intellectual. It's like, well, why can't I be an independent intellectual, right? Like you can be an independent musician, and I have, deep ties to that world. But yeah, you can also be an independent creator. And so I think for me, that spirit of indie, of independence, has really fueled my approach, and I've made documentary films, I've written again, I have played in the band. And it's interesting because politically I'm very much for institutions and I fight for public funding, but in my personal work I am someone who is like institution adjacent. And I think it's that spirit of like, well, yeah, just do it. Like you want to learn about a subject, well, then just dive in all the way. And that doesn't mean I'm doing it on my own, really. I'm often asking for help. I'm interviewing people. I'm reading books. But it's a little bit, it is definitely a bit of that towny spirit taken into another domain. Like in Athens, and I love the Athens artist community, but I always was a little bit of an outlier because I was such a nerd, And so I was like, I think I've found my equivalent of that bohemian creative community in organizing in politics, right? Where it's people who live and breathe social justice, philosophy, political discourse. It just that wasn't a scene in Athens back in the 90s and the early aughts, unfortunately for me.
And I sense you know it, like it's like when you're it's like arts and music, it's not so much like what one does as much as just being curious and creative and playful and
Mm-hmm.
messing around and effing around, and
Yeah.
and kind of like not seeing things in these hyper judgmental, rash, like maybe linear ways, flattened ways.
Or as fixed ways, right? I mean, artists take things and make something new of it. And I do think the Debt Collective was founded by a mixture of artists and academics, sort of, and I think that was a fruitful combination because there was kind of deep seriousness like about how financial structures work, how political structures work, but also like, let's take these elements and make something. Let's experiment. Let's play, as you say, because building movements is as much art as science. You never know when the next thing is going to kick off. You never really know what's going to resonate. You never know if what you put out there is going to find its audience, or maybe you're ahead of your time. You're too avant-garde, So I think that playful creative spirit is a real part of political change. And that's where we have to humble ourselves. Again, it's not just the ideas. It's not just like, I got the perfect platform. I've got the perfect solution, It's how do you get people information together to do something that's never been done before, to try something new, to get out of their comfort zone? And I think a facility in the arts does actually really help with that kind of risk taking, that willingness to kind of maybe mess up and to be in the mess.
And really how arts and organizing are all about community, right? And like that's something I just feel and sense as just a spirit to like all the things you do and engage with. So, all right, final question. It's sort of a question we ask everybody. This podcast is called Utopias. You mentioned you like that the word utopia. Like, speak to me a little bit about, I know you have many ideas that would be tied to this, but like a utopian vision that you feel like, at this time, as we're recording this, July 11th, 2025, like, where do you like, what and where would be a utopia for you that we can all start moving toward?
Yeah, I'm just going to double down on that vision of free reparative education. So I like to say that I want to see a world where education is free as in price and also free as in aimed at freedom. A place where you're free to be curious, where you're also free to study without being afraid that you're going to be deported or afraid that you're going to be censored for speaking out about things like ongoing genocide. And I think it's one of these adjacent utopias, right? It's like it's something there. The seeds of it are actually here. The foundations are here. We can look to the past for some examples. We can go, wow, University of California, that was free back in the 60s and 70s. It could be even more expansively thus in the future. So that is something, and I think it's an important utopian horizon to keep in mind, because the right wing wouldn't be attacking higher education with such viciousness if it actually wasn't a really strategic piece of terrain. And so I think that is a crucial fight in this battle against the end times fascists. And it's something, and I say this again as like an independent scholar, artist, organizer type. I don't have literal skin in the game. I am not an academic. And I think for those of us who are just whatever, we're concerned humans, concerned citizens, I think we actually need to really step up and be part of that, be part of the fight for public education more broadly.
This was so amazing, Astra. Thank you. I know we went quite a long conversation. It's first of many, many conversations. I appreciate you very much. Thank you for joining us, Astra. Appreciate
Thanks
you.
for having me.
Let's keep chatting and building. I'm really excited about it. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Your support means the world to us. Our podcast is really focused on creativity, on care, on stories of inspiration, and inspiring characters of all kinds. It's such a wonderful, wonderful way to reach community. This is a labor of love. So the real way we can sustain ourselves is through all of your support. Please rate, ideally 5 stars. Please share this with anyone and everyone you know. And feel free to reach out to us also with suggestions on guests. Reach us at podcastutopias@gmail.com. Thank you, everybody, for your support.